Welcome to More Than Miles, where we use storytelling and expert interviews to empower endurance athletes and healthcare providers. I'm Dr. Kate Mihivik-Edwards, physical therapist, author, educator, entrepreneur, and former endurance athlete.
And I'm Dr. Kacy Saunders, physical therapist, runner, and triathlete, and together we're your co-hosts. Our goal is to always keep our athletes healthy on and off the road, because we know that our athletes are so much more than their body and their sport. We're glad you're on this journey with us. Now let's get to the show.
We're happy to have you guys with us today, and we are excited to have our good friend and colleague, Coach Carl, on the podcast today. Carl's an incredible coach. We love collaborating with him, and a lot of his athletes are our patients, which is really fantastic. Carl has been running and contributing to the running community for over 20 years. He was the associate coach at Emory cross country and track for 8 years, is a level 2 USA track and field endurance coach, and regularly contributes to Runner's World, Women's Health, Competitor, and many other publications. I'll never forget when I first met Carl, because I used to do solo track workouts after my long days of physical therapy school education. One particular day, it was rainy, it was disgusting, and I think Carl was like, wow, this girl's really hardcore. I wonder if she wants to join my group. He's actually a big reason of my connection with Kate. So thank you, and welcome to the podcast, Carl.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I would like to second that. I'm so excited you're here, Carl. I remember our first meeting was actually at a physical therapy place I was working at. And you actually had asked if there are any therapists that want to hear about working with a coach. And I think I was the only one that was like, yes, me, please. And so it ended up being you and I, even though there were several therapists there. And we talked for a long time, and I left and thought, wow, God, I love this guy. How didn't I know him before?
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, given your reputation in the running community before that meeting, you were the one I was most interested in meeting with anyway. So it worked out well.
Why don't we start talking a little bit about kind of your journey with running? So we had said that you'd been running or been contributing to the running community for at least 20 years. And I'd love for our listeners to hear a little bit more about that journey.
Yeah, sure. It's a little depressing some days that it's closer to 30 years now than 20 years. But yeah, I actually started running in middle school. There was the long distance running club that met after school 2 days a week. And it was myself and my best friend, Marcus. And that was it. It was just the two of us. And so I got started doing that, and then decided to run cross country in high school as a way to sort of help meet people. Fell in love with the sport, kept running competitively through college, cross country and track at Colorado College. And then after college, certainly wasn't a good enough runner to like continue on professionally or anything, but did train seriously for a while to hit some goals that I hadn't been able to hit in college. Shortly after moving to Atlanta is when I started working at Emory, and started off as a volunteer there, and then moved into the associate position where I coached the men's cross country and distance track runners, like Kacy said, for 8 years. By that point, I was married, and we were looking at having kids, and the collegiate coaching lifestyle just wasn't going to be a good fit for me and for having a family. And so got out of collegiate coaching, started doing personal coaching, and have really, I think, found a good fit for me where I work with adults that are serious about their running and that want to get better, but they understand that running is just a piece of their life. So that's sort of the niche that I seek out and really try to make sure that I'm on the same page with people before I start working with them. Because I think so many adult runners have this unrealistic idea of what they have to be doing or what they should be doing. And I find great joy in telling them that they can do less than they're currently doing and actually be faster. So
doing less? What?
Yeah, right. Yeah, not a message we hear every day.
That's what I love about you, Carl, because I feel like people when they don't really know what to do, they tend to do too much. And I think you're really good at looking, okay, like here, this is what your life looks like. This is what is necessary. And you can really map that out for people who have a hard time figuring that out on their own.
Yeah. And I think, one of my sort of coaching mentors is a gentleman named Scott Simmons. He sort of taught me the idea of what's called athlete-centered coaching. And so basically, instead of, this idea that there is a, Coach Carl system that you have to follow or you have to do X, Y, or Z, that you really have to start with the athlete and where they're at and what they're capable of doing and what they have, the time and the motivation to do, and work around their life and their schedule if you want them to be successful, that it can't be a coach-centered coaching model. It has to be an athlete-centered coaching model.
For those people out there listening to our podcast that have never had a coach and they're hearing what you have to say and they say, oh, wow, Carl gets it. I have a life outside of running. I love running. I think it's a huge part of my life. What do you say to those people? Why should they have a coach?
Well, Kate, you know me well. I'm not great at selling myself. I'm
not trying to get you to sell yourself. I'm just trying to get people to understand how important it is to have a coach, because in my opinion, and I think, Kacy, you believe this as well, you're part of the reason people can stay injury free and can have a longevity in their sport. And that's something that we really want. We want people out on the road. So while it will hopefully benefit you, it'll really benefit everybody else to hear why it's important.
For sure. And when I say selling myself, I mean selling the idea of coaching in general even is not my forte. But I think the biggest thing with runners is this idea that more is better. And, I think where a coach can be most helpful, if that is an issue that you're struggling with, is I can come in and I can both have a very small view of exactly where you are right now, right? A lot of runners struggle with this idea of who they were as a runner a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And when I come into a new coaching relationship, I don't know that, right? I mean, I might know it from the questionnaire or what you told me, your PRs were. But what I know you as a runner is where you're at right now. And so I can take a much smaller view in some ways, but I can also take the big picture view of, hey, what's happening today and what's happening this week isn't the whole story. And so we need to have a big picture view of what's happening. And that includes the rest of your life. And that includes, one of my favorite phrases is stress, right? I mean, anybody that I've worked with has heard me say that 100 times. And it just means that physiologically, our bodies don't distinguish between different sources of stress. So whether it's sickness or job stress, relationship stress, any of those types of things, it all counts the same. And training stress is part of that. And so sometimes it takes an outside person like a coach to say, no, it's okay to do less. And this is actually a better fit for your life and for where you're at for overall stress levels. And therefore, it's going to be more beneficial for you than doing more. And, there's also the issue of just runner's guilt. We tend to feel guilty if we're not doing as much as we can or as much as we hear the next person is. And again, sort of having that outside perspective, I think can be really helpful, where I'm not there for the conversations with your friends and with your training partners. And I don't know how many miles a week they're claiming to do. And I don't have the same Strava feed as you do. And so there isn't, I'm making decisions based on where you're at as a runner and what the next logical step is, rather than a lot of these outside sort of peer pressure forces that you might be under.
Yeah. And I think the big benefit of having a coach is being able to make those adjustments in real time. So a lot of people, they'll go and find a plan online and follow that to the T, no matter how they're feeling, what happens, come hell or high water, they're going to follow that plan. And I would be someone who is like that for sure, because, you see it written down and you don't want to do anything other than what's written down. But I think that adjustment piece is really important. So I'm really interested to hear your process of how you take what your athletes tell you and then change their path, so to say, on their way to their goals.
Yeah, well, it always looks different, right, for each person and sort of depending on where they're at. I can tell you the sort of most frequent adjustments that I make to people's training is fewer speed workouts. It is very, very rare that I coach someone and give them more than one speed workout a week. I probably put in more recovery days and more off days than they're used to doing. One of my golden rules, when I start working with somebody, we go through their background questionnaire. One of the questions is, how many days a week can you realistically run? Almost everybody puts down a range, right? So they'll put, 3 to 4 days or 4 to 5 days. And I just automatically assume the lower end of that, right? We are going to automatically round down, make things a little bit easier for you. And then if there's a situation where we can build back up, that's great. But it's always better to start at a level that might be not enough and build up over time than the other way around. And, there's the classic quote about it's better to be 10% undertrained than 1% overtrained. And I believe that completely.
And actually, you've talked about two things that we talked about in one of our last podcasts, the stress and the 10% undertrained. So we are totally on board with you.
Fantastic.
I might have given different percentages, but the point is it's better to be undertrained than overtrained.
Absolutely. Yeah. And 10-1 is what I've always heard, but I am certainly willing to adjust those numbers and still believe in the validity of it.
What kind of things are people struggling with right now? Since we're talking about stress and all of these things, what have you found is happening with your athletes?
Kate, you're one of the last people I saw socially before everything shut down. We had coffee and we said, why is everybody freaking out? The whole world's going crazy. And then you texted me at like 10 o'clock that night and said, the NBA just canceled their season. And I thought, oh my gosh, like what is happening? I was concerned what my business was going to look like with no races. For a long time, there were no races, no fall marathons, which, are obviously a big deal in our sport. So I was very surprised how many people really wanted structure and really wanted a coaching plan still, even when there were no races happening. Part of that is there was very little that felt concrete in the world at large for a while there. And so knowing that this is my running assignment for the day at least gave you a bit of an anchor. As we got into the fall and as we got into the winter, the lack of races really started to drag on people. What people have been struggling with the most, to directly answer your question, is direction and knowing what to do. And those are conversations I have individually because it depends on the person. But in a lot of cases, it's, all right, well, if we can, fingers crossed, point to marathons in the fall of this year, let's start to build up your mileage a little bit, or let's work on leg speed because you've done 3 marathon training cycles in a row and you haven't, done anything faster than that in a while, or things like that. Just to try to give people a sense of purpose and a sense of direction with their training, because so many runners get that from preparing for a race. And when there aren't any races or very few races and maybe not guaranteed to happen, that gets very demoralizing. And so really trying to keep people in on, more process-oriented goals and less outcome-oriented goals, which I think as a coach and as a runner is the way to go all the time, but it's just not how most people think about it. And so, trying to get people in that mindset and see the value of it without a set end point has been definitely the conversation I've had the most frequently in the last 12 months.
Yeah. And I've just from my own experience and from what I've seen, like my runner friends do, not having races has actually been really good for a lot of people. Just not as much pressure to train, more willing to take those days off to listen to their body because there's no pressure. There's no race date. There's nothing really on the horizon. I know this has had a different effect for everybody, but I think there has been benefits. And we've seen this even in professional racing with a lot of the track groups out right now that people are running extremely well, just focusing on the process and not having this regular season, which I have found really interesting.
Yeah, and hopefully they carry those lessons forward, right? Hopefully they don't sort of slip into bad habits of being OCD about I must do X, Y, and Z, once we get back to being able to pick a race and point towards it and train for it.
Did you just say you wanted runners and triathletes or endurance athletes in general to be less OCD?
Yes.
That's a big dream, Carl.
Yeah, well, I'm an optimist.
Yeah, wishful thinking for sure.
However, it is a good lesson. So if you really think about that, looking at the process, but then also looking at people had a lot more rest going into this. There was a lot of stress in the world, but you're at home, you're with your family. I guess you could look at it either way. That could be more stressful.
Pros and cons. Yeah.
Pros and cons, but people were resting more. And if they're coming out faster and stronger, that does say a lot.
Well, and I think, the extra time piece of it, the lack of a commute is where I hope people have spent a little more time on the quote unquote little things, stretching and foam rolling and strength training that they never liked to do and always claimed it was because they didn't have time to do. Hopefully they've put that lack of a commute time to good use and they'll come out of it as better runners for that too.
I'm extremely hopeful as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So speaking of like process oriented training, what does that look like for you, Carl? And like, what kind of conversations do you have with your runners about process oriented training?
Yeah, so I think it's important to say that I don't always have conversations with people about process-oriented training. Frequently, the process-oriented training happens in the background without them ever knowing about it, and I don't have to convince them of it because I'm, taking it into account as I write their training. But so an example of process-oriented training that I think is an example a lot of people can relate to and can identify with and benefit from is somebody who's training for their second marathon. And, when you train for your first marathon, it's going to go the way it's going to go, right? Like if you have a good training plan, you increase your odds greatly of having an enjoyable experience. But how your body is going to react to the marathon distance is always going to be an unknown. And so, you race the marathon, it goes how it goes, good or bad. And then you start looking ahead to the second marathon. And one mistake that I think a lot of people make is they think that it makes sense to just repeat the training that they did for the first marathon. And you're not the same runner. That training doesn't make sense anymore. A beginner's marathon training plan will leave an awful lot of time improvement on the table if you try to just follow it a second time through. So I think a great example of a process-oriented goal that I recommend to people with that is, all right, we're not going to try to go longer for our longest long run before the marathon, right? And again, this is assuming that they're already going over 20 miles, which is something I feel strongly about. But, we're not going to try to go longer for your longest training run, but we're going to have a higher density of longer runs, right? So instead of, alternating between a high mileage long run and a low mileage long run where 50% of your long runs are long and 50% are recovery, we're going to switch it so that we're going to do some long ones, we're going to do some medium ones, we're going to do some easy runs. So now 2/3 of your long runs, we can say are building endurance for the marathon and only 1/3 is recovery. Trying to quantify what that's going to do for your marathon performance is something that's out of my league. But what I do know is the process goal of, saying we're going to go from 50% of your long runs are focused on increasing your endurance to 66% of your long runs are focused on increasing your endurance. That's going to pay off on race day. And, but there's no set numbers that we're working with in terms of mileage or distance or, anything like that. And so it's more of a idea of this will help improve your endurance and the payoff on race day is unknown, but expected.
What are the common mistakes that you're seeing with your athletes, either when they first come to see you, which it might be too much, you've mentioned that, but, or maybe somebody who you've been working with for a long time and they may just kind of come on and off again? What are those mistakes that you're seeing runners make?
Well, I think, other than just trying to do too much, I think probably the biggest mistake that I see runners make is not understanding the whole stress adaptation process. That's probably at the root of most of the mistakes, whether it's doing too much, whether it's trying to increase too quickly, doing too many speed workouts, all of those sorts of things, I think ultimately come from a fundamental lack of understanding of the stress adaptation curve. And, a conversation about that is probably not great in an audio setting. But, basically the idea is that you have a baseline ability to perform. And when you introduce a stressor, that baseline ability to perform goes down. If I asked you to run a 5K and you had a week's worth of great nights of sleep and everything was going great in your life, you'd run X. If I asked you to run it after your kid had gotten you up 3 times during the night before because they were crying or whatever, you would run slower than that, right? So stress decreases your ability to perform. If it's appropriate stress and if it's a beneficial stress, a training stress, then given enough time, your body's ability to perform improves. And so that's called supercompensation. And that's how we get better as runners. If our body didn't adapt to these training stresses we give it, we wouldn't get better. We would just have our God-given ability to run, and that would be that. What's important to understand there is 2 things. One, the improvement happens during the recovery. The hard workout, the training stress is an opportunity to improve. It's a signal to your body to adapt and improve, but the actual improvements happen during the recovery period. Along with that is the second point, which that recovery period takes several days. And so, if I asked you to go run a 5K, again, you'd run X time. if I asked you to run 4 by mile at, sort of cruise repeats, that's something that should make you better at running the 5K, but not if I asked you to run a 5K the next day. Right. And so, you've got to allow that appropriate amount of time for your body to adapt and improve. Otherwise, you just end up with a downward slope where if you introduce the new stress before that improvement takes place, you just go down and down and down. And like I said, I think a fundamental misunderstanding or just total lack of awareness of the stress adaptation curve is sort of at the root of most of the problems that I see with people.
I would agree with you in terms of, from our perspective, almost always an injury happens because of training error or overuse in some way. If they're not understanding that what stress does to their body and how it breaks it down, then they end up injured and in our clinic or our offices.
This is maybe a side note that is only tangentially related, but understanding what stresses are appropriate for your training. I saw someone on Strava the other day who I won't name any names, but it said that their workout was 4 by 10 minutes at 5K pace. And it's like, either you're not racing as fast as you could, or you're running that workout significantly slower than 5K pace, or that is just a wildly difficult workout that is going to leave you wrecked for a very long time. And so, my rule of thumb is always you leave the workout feeling like you could do one more rep. It's better to underdo it just a little bit. Yeah. So when I see things like that, it's like, oh boy, somebody really is not understanding the amount and the type of stress that workout's putting on their body, and is definitely falling in the trap of more is better.
I am getting a lot of patients who have coaches and really enjoying communicating with coaches. And a theme I've noticed is that they're not telling their coach everything I wish they would tell them. So what types of things do you want to hear? What do you feel like is really important for your athletes to tell you as they're going through their daily training?
Well, I probably have a similar experience, Kacy, and that's why you get so many text messages from me throughout a week of like, hey, what did you actually tell this person? I want to make sure that I'm getting the story straight from the horse's mouth. The biggest things to me are, is this an injury that running more is going to aggravate more, or is continuing to run going to aggravate and make worse? Or is this something that we can train through to a certain extent? And if so, what extent? One of the things that I always like to hear from PTs is, when we get back to a point where we're increasing the training again, is this something that volume is likely to aggravate more, or intensity is likely to aggravate more? And having done this for a while now, most sort of common injuries, I have a pretty good idea, but I always like to double check to say, okay, what are you seeing form wise with this person? What are you seeing, injury wise with this person? And as we start to ramp things up, where do I need to be more cautious?
That's great. And I think that a lot of healthcare providers struggle with, what do coaches need to know, or don't know how to communicate with their coaches well. So I think that's really important for us as healthcare providers, whether you're a physical therapist or not, is to really build that relationship with the coaches that you're working with. So you can have, that text message chain or email chain that says, hey, what is going on? Because when there's a miscommunication or a communication gap, it really can impact the athlete and how they're improving and how they're performing.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kate, I know that you and I have talked about this before, but one of the great benefits of having a coach and a PT who are on the same page with the patient is when you tell a patient, okay, it's okay to go test this out on a short, easy run, that they hear, I'm going to run 8 miles this weekend and see how it feels, but in my mind, a good coach hears a PT says that and says, okay, great. We're going to start with 15 minutes this weekend and we're going to see how it goes, and I think that a good, responsible coach is more likely going to be on the same page with you as far as like what short and what easy and things like that mean than the average runner. And hopefully either hearing it from 2 people will help them actually do it, or seeing it written down on a training plan again will sort of give them quote unquote permission to actually run that short and run that easy.
Yeah. And I think from both a physical therapy and a coach perspective, teaching, especially people who are newer to the sport, how to listen to their bodies is huge as well.
I mean, how would they know? Like, they have no experience with it, and running hurts when you start. It's hard. It's painful. Like, it's no fun. So if you listen to your body, you'd never do it again. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that it is really important to help with that process. And yes, running is a very natural activity for us. But if you haven't done it in 20 to 30 to 40 years, it sure as hell not going to feel like it when you get out there. So, and that's where I think, going back to the stress adaptation thing, it's important for people to have expectations of what this is going to feel like and how long you have to keep at it before it's going to start to feel easier. Because I think a lot of people give up in week 2, where if they stuck with it through week 3 or week 4, they'd start to enjoy it a lot more.
I'm so glad you said that. So many more people could be running that want to run, but they do give it up early because they just don't know and they don't have the support team around them. A lot of people just run, grab any pair of running shoes, go out and run a few miles, can't walk the next day because they did too much and say, screw this, running's not for me.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, more times than I can count, I've heard people say, well, I ran a mile the first day. And so then I thought, well, I better run 2 miles the second day. And then, I'll run 3 miles the third day. And yeah, I mean, it's nobody's going to enjoy that. And no, I agree with you completely. The number of people who have tried running and that want to run and have just sort of had a bad situation or approach with it makes me sad that they might just have written running off when they could be really enjoying it.
For a new runner, this has been something I've been wanting to ask a couple times. And then, Kacy, I promise I'll let you ask your question. For those of you who are hearing this, I can see we're just raising our hands. Who's going to ask the next question? But for people that don't know what a speed workout is or what the different types of workouts you can do for running, could you just explain the basics of that? Because a lot of people, when they come in for an evaluation, say it's a new runner who's injured themselves, I'll say, okay, well, how many speed workouts do you do? Are you doing hill repeats? Are you doing long runs, middle distance? What's your pace? I'll ask all these questions and I'll get a glazed look because they don't know what I'm talking about.
Right. And I'm super excited to be part of the first 2-hour podcast that you guys have ever done as I launch into this answer. Yeah, no, the really short version of this answer in my mind, and this is what I tell people, is a speed workout is any time that you're running faster than your easy run pace. I tend to talk more than speed days and easy days. I tend to talk about hard days and easy days. Because a long run is always going to count as a hard day when we talk about things like the stress adaptation curve, even though the pace it should be easy. With that as a caveat. So I think of speed work, like I said, as anything that's faster than what you've been doing. There are many different subcategories that you can divide that into. You'll hear people talk about tempo runs, and you hear people talk about 2 max repeats and neuromuscular speed work and lactic threshold work. And there's a lot of overlap in all those different terms. There's a lot of poorly defined terms and sort of lack of common understanding among runners and among coaches of what those things are, partly because of that. Particularly for beginner runners, although I do this with everybody that I coach to a certain extent. It's going to vary person to person, particularly as people sort of get into a training cycle again. I love the idea of effort-based speed workouts. The short definition of that is it's a speed workout that has no set paces. And I think that's really important when people are just starting out, because it will help them learn more about their bodies and learn how to listen to their bodies more. An example of that type of workout that I recommend all the time is just an effort-based cut down run. The general theory behind it is you're going to run a little ways as a warm-up at a truly easy pace, whatever feels easy that day. And that needs to take into account how much sleep you've been getting, stress levels, if you had too many margaritas the night before, if the weather's terrible, all that sort of stuff. So don't come into it with a preconceived idea. Just run a truly easy pace. And then, each half mile after that or each mile after that, you're going to pick up the pace a little bit. And you're going to do that 3 or 4 or 5 times. And then you're going to finish with some easy running. And so it's going to help you learn what easy pace is, hopefully. But then also it'll help you learn a little bit more how to identify different effort levels within your running. Okay, how long can I hold this effort. Like, if I feel like this when I'm running hard, oh, it turns out I can't hold that for the full mile. Okay, fine. I can take that information and learn from it going forward. Where if I just said, okay, I want you to run the first mile at 9-minute pace, the second mile at 8:40, the third mile at 8:20, the fourth mile at 8 flat, you may be able to do that. You may push yourself harder than you would have if it was an effort-based workout, but you may not learn much about what effort levels are sustainable because you're always thinking about things pace-wise. This sort of takes the question out of the beginner realm a little bit, but that becomes so useful when you're racing and the conditions are bad. If you can throw pace out the window and trust the feedback your body's giving you to tell you, is this effort that I'm putting forth in a race sustainable? You have a much better shot of having a good race in a challenging race condition setting than somebody who everything's just been done by the watch.
You're horribly inaccurate as well.
Yeah, well, there's that. Don't get me started on GPS watches. Yeah, I meant the stopwatch.
Oh, the stopwatch.
I'm old school. Yeah, everything done by the stopwatch. Yeah.
Can you enlighten me? What's a stopwatch?
Yeah, right. I did at some point in my coaching career switch to a digital one. And now I have an iPad app where I can have 30 different stopwatches all on the same screen for each individual person at the track workouts. So I'm not completely against technology. It should be accurate.
I love a good Coach Carl soapbox. I really do.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites. Yeah.
The last thing I want to do is ask, what is your best piece of advice for any runner, whether it's a new runner or it's somebody who's been out there for a really long time? What is the best piece of advice you could give them?
Remember that it's supposed to be fun. And, I hear people all the time that say, oh, I hate marathons, but, I signed up for Chicago this year, or like, whatever. And it's like, look, none of us are professionals, right? None of us are training for the Olympics. None of us are making our living through running. And so why are you doing something if it's not fun? And, and that's another thing that I try to get at with people when I start working with them. What kind of workouts do you like and what kind of workouts do you hate? Because let's make sure you're doing a lot of the kinds of workouts you like and not too many of the ones that you hate. And I think there's physiological reasons for that too, but I know that there are psychological reasons for that. If it stops being fun, I just don't know what the point is anymore. That's one of the things that I enjoy so much about working with adults that I felt was missing a lot of times in the collegiate setting. I found myself getting so disillusioned when kids would run huge PRs in cross-country races or 5K track races, and they'd be bummed out because they didn't finish as high up as they wanted to. This should be more, I get in a collegiate competitive setting where you finish place-wise matters. And I frequently would get upset that we didn't finish as high as we wanted to either. But it just seemed like what I loved about running was the individual piece of it. And the sense of accomplishment of achieving goals and just the day-to-day feeling that you have when you're out there. Anybody who's doing training that isn't fun or that is training for something that isn't fun or just isn't enjoying it needs to take a step back and look at why, because I think it should always be enjoyable.
Fun is the best part about running. I know there were times I pushed myself way too much and it wasn't fun, but I always came back when I gave myself a break.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to what Kacy was saying, towards the beginning about all these people that are finding themselves running better now because there's less pressure on them. Well, where's that pressure coming from? Like, how many people really care what you run in your next race, right? Like, this is almost all self-imposed. That's probably one of the biggest differences in my adult viewpoint and my, sort of extended adolescent viewpoint is most people really don't care what you're doing, really aren't paying that much attention to you. Taking some of that imagined external pressure off probably is a big part of why people are enjoying running more, maybe during the pandemic, but also running better during the pandemic.
When I turned 40 a couple months ago, I was like, screw it. We're good. I hit that
point a while ago. It's been a while that I came to the realization that like, we're all just trying to get through the day. We're just all trying to make our way through the world. And we're really not paying that much attention to what anybody else is doing because we don't have the mental capacity and energy to do it. So,
absolutely not. I love that. That's a great reminder.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially these days, right? My favorite joke that I've heard recently, I haven't told a joke on this podcast yet, What?
And
Incredible.
No puns. I feel very disappointed. Yeah.
I know. My favorite thing I've seen recently is, so humans are 70% water. So we're basically just all cucumbers with anxiety.
Yeah. That's pretty good.
So if you just think of everybody as a cucumber with anxiety, it's not that scary anymore.
No, it's not.
Yeah, that's the metaphysical version of picture everybody in their underwear, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Hey, Carl, did you see Kacy's video of PT Rex doing her home exercises the other day?
Maybe. I feel, no, not if it was the other day. No. I was going to say, I've seen Kacy in her T-Rex costume so much that they do start to blend together a little bit.
Well, it's becoming part of her uniform at this point, I think.
That's pretty amazing. Yeah.
It has. I keep it in my car.
And again, it's just important to not worry about what people are thinking.
That's right.
It brings you joy, Kacy. You should do it.
Oh, it brings me so much joy. You have no idea.
It brings so many people joy.
You're right. Yeah, absolutely.
Brings me
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Carl. We really appreciate you coming on today and talking through some of this stuff. I think it's going to be very valuable for a lot of people listening out there.
Well, I appreciate that. And I always enjoy an opportunity to spread the gospel of, more enjoyable running.
Yeah. Thanks, Carl. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Virtually.
So can I plug something real quick?
Oh, I forgot to ask you about your website and your...
Yeah.
Yeah, here we go. Please tell us how people can reach you.
Yeah. If you're interested in my coaching or the track workouts that I host, it's runningcoachcarl.com. And then also just recently, I've started a video series for podiumrunner.com called The Common Sense Coach. If some of these ideas that I talked about today sound appealing and not something that you're hearing elsewhere, you can get my thoughts on more specific training related things from that common sense perspective every other Monday on podiumrunner.com. Thanks for talking, and it was good chatting with you guys. It's been a while.
Me too. It has been a while.
Thank you so much for hanging out with us. We hope that you enjoyed today's conversation. As you can tell, we absolutely love spreading knowledge about endurance athlete health.
Be sure to subscribe and rate the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you happen to be listening in from. It really helps us get the word out about our show so that we can reach more awesome people like you. Be sure to share the show with your friends, running buddies, training partner, family, dog, scream it from the rooftops, whatever works for you. See you soon.